The year is 1769. Captain James Cook's expedition has just arrived at what would later be known as Botany Bay. His crew consists of experienced navigators who have encountered indigenous populations throughout the Pacific and believe they understood what such encounters would entail. Within moments of arriving on New Zealand shores, their assumptions about combat and indigenous warfare would be fundamentally challenged. A lone Maori warrior emerged from the forest. He moved without aggression or theatricality, simply walking forward with measured purpose. What he carried caused Cook's men to recoil in shock. It was not merely a weapon, but an engineering marvel, an instrument combining the piercing force of a spear, the crushing power of a club, and the symbolic weight of cultural identity into one expertly balanced tool of conflict. Yet this weapon represented only the surface. The true source of Maori warrior effectiveness lay not in their equipment, but in their psychological and physical conditioning. Consider Kupe, a genuine historical warrior from the early contact period. While European soldiers were still drilling in formation, Kupe had already completed training regimens that would challenge modern elite athletes. Before dawn, he would sprint up nearly vertical mountain paths carrying weights exceeding the mass of full medieval armor. Physical capability, however, was merely the foundation. The actual transformation occurred at higher elevations. Overlooking mist-filled valleys, Kupe engaged in practices entirely foreign to European military tradition, developing the ability to anticipate opponents' decisions while moving with perfect stealth. European warfare relied on predictable formations, coordinated maneuvers, and concentrated firepower. Maori combat strategy had evolved something far more formidable: the capacity to understand an opponent's psychology and exploit that understanding in real time. Kupe studied captured European military texts, not merely to learn tactics, but to comprehend the reasoning behind them, the fears, assumptions, and conceptual limitations of European military thought. He became what might be called a tactical specialist, capable of adjusting his approach to any opponent instantaneously. What truly distinguished Maori warriors, however, was their capacity to enhance European warfare systems rather than simply oppose them. During the 1846 engagement at Ruapakapika, British forces arrived with superior artillery, hundreds of professional soldiers, and confidence born from decades of imperial conquest. They expected to overwhelm any indigenous fortification. What transpired revealed why Maori warriors represented an entirely different category of opponent. The fortification itself was not built on traditional principles. Rather, it was designed based on systematic analysis of European siege methodology and British artillery tactics. The walls were engineered to absorb cannon fire through multiple layers of different materials that would decelerate projectiles without fragmenting. Underground passageways enabled defenders to move along the perimeter unseen. The fortress's greatest strength, however, was not architectural but intellectual. Its commander was a warrior named Kawiti, whose distinctive quality was not courage or physical prowess, but strategic intelligence. Kawiti had accomplished what British commanders considered impossible from an indigenous leader. He had anticipated each British tactical decision, prepared responses to each possible maneuver, and developed contingencies several steps beyond those British commanders would likely take. As British artillery began their sustained bombardment, Kawiti's forces did not retreat to defensive positions. Instead, they used the noise as cover for constant repositioning, preventing British observers from establishing target locations. When British infantry attacked, they encountered not desperate resistance, but deliberately vacated positions. Maori fighters had already relocated to flanking positions the British had not conceived of. After days of bombardment breached the walls, British soldiers discovered the most demoralizing realization possible. The fortress was empty, not abandoned in defeat, but strategically evacuated with precise timing. Kawiti had permitted the British to exhaust their ammunition, demonstrate their capabilities, and commit their resources to a location that was never intended as the primary engagement zone. The actual battle commenced once British soldiers, believing themselves victorious, found themselves surrounded within an empty stronghold while Maori warriors attacked from positions they had never identified. This was not fortunate circumstance or primitive ingenuity. This represented military strategy operating at a sophistication level European commanders could not process. Yet tactical excellence was only one component of Maori warrior capability. The essential advantage came from their psychological preparation for combat. European soldiers received training in obedience, formation maintenance, and equipment operation. Maori warriors underwent training in independent judgment, instantaneous adaptation, and psychological resilience. This process began in childhood. While European children learned academics, Maori children learned environmental analysis, meteorological patterns, and human behavior interpretation. They developed something resembling what modern analysts might call tactical intuition, the capacity to evaluate intricate situations and respond optimally without deliberate reasoning. The mental conditioning transcended tactical training entirely. Before significant battles, Maori warriors underwent a psychological process that bewildered European observers. They identified it as spiritual ritual, though it functioned as sophisticated mental conditioning. Warriors would abstain from food for extended periods, not to create weakness but to achieve intensified consciousness, where typical human constraints ceased to apply. They would recite genealogies connecting them to legendary predecessors, implanting into their subconscious the absolute conviction that failure could not occur. Then came the Haka. Europeans perceived fierce expressions and aggressive movements and interpreted these as primitive intimidation. They fundamentally misunderstood what was occurring. The Haka was actually a psychological transformation mechanism capable of converting an ordinary individual into something transcending normal human limitations. Every movement was precisely designed to eliminate apprehension, uncertainty, and hesitation. Every vocalization was calibrated to reprogram the participant's mind for optimal combat performance. Upon completion, the individual who had commenced the ritual no longer existed. He had transformed into something different, a combat specialist with no exceptional mental clarity, unwavering self-assurance, and freedom from death anxiety. This clarifies why European documentation of Maori warrior encounters frequently employs language suggesting supernatural phenomena. These were not ordinary humans. They were psychologically enhanced combat professionals who had eliminated every psychological vulnerability that typically renders humans susceptible in warfare. Potentially most significantly, Maori warriors possessed a capability European military doctrine had never encountered: the ability to reassess and enhance strategy during active combat. European tactics derived from rigid strategic systems developed across centuries of European conflict. When these systems failed, European militaries had to withdraw, reanalyze, and develop replacement approaches over extended periods. Maori warriors could evaluate failed strategy, determine causative factors, formulate alternative approaches, and execute them within hours or even minutes. This evolutionary intelligence made them virtually impossible to defeat through conventional military methodology. Any European advantage would be examined, comprehended, and neutralized before European leadership even perceived the threat to that advantage. Consider their engagement with European firearms. Rather than attempting to acquire more firearms which would have perpetuated their disadvantage, Maori warriors analyzed how European soldiers deployed firearms and created tactics that essentially nullified their effectiveness. They recognized that European soldiers required time between shots for reloading, so they cultivated rapid assault techniques capable of closing distance before reloading could complete. They observed that European firearms functioned poorly in wet conditions, so they became proficient at combat in weather that negated European advantages. They identified that European soldiers depended on formation structure, so they perfected techniques for disrupting formations that European training could not counter. This transcended simple tactical adjustment. This represented adaptive warfare, the capacity to evolve and enhance strategy faster than adversaries could create countermeasures. Most significantly, Maori warriors were only beginning their development. European military dominance originated from technological advancement and numerical superiority. Maori warrior culture was grounded in individual capacity and psychological excellence. While European militaries depended on external circumstances beyond their control, Maori warriors had cultivated internal capabilities applicable in any scenario. Despite European illness reducing Maori populations, despite overwhelming European technology, despite suppression of traditional warrior practices, the fundamental psychological conditioning underlying Maori warrior effectiveness never vanished. It transformed. The psychological mechanisms that once generated unbeatable warriors began generating unbeatable competitors, strategic innovators, and visionary administrators. The adaptive intelligence that once revolutionized Pacific conflict began revolutionizing contemporary competition, commerce, and invention. The psychological training that previously eliminated fear in warfare now eliminates fear of inadequacy in all contexts. The strategic approach that once outmaneuvered European forces now navigates modern obstacles that appear insurmountable. This constitutes the genuine danger represented by Maori warriors. They were not simply contending for land or resources. They were demonstrating that human capacity has no inherent ceiling when appropriately cultivated. They were exhibiting that psychological development could transcend any technological gap, any numerical disadvantage, any apparently insurmountable obstacle. That principle continues to carry implications today, because it signifies that authentic limitations are solely those we internalize mentally. The significance of Maori warriors transcends historical documentation or cultural commemoration. It concerns the demonstrated reality of human performance at levels most individuals cannot fathom. This is precisely why their narrative has been marginalized. This is precisely why their methodologies have been misunderstood. This is precisely why their accomplishments have been understated. Because universal comprehension of actual human potential, when systematically developed and psychologically optimized, would transform everything. This is the actual danger of Maori warriors. They verified it was achievable.